Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. When the Civil War ended, her parents became involved in Reconstruction politics, which taught her from a young age about the importance of being politically informed and educated. James Wells, her father, was part of the Freedmen's Aid Society that assisted in setting up Shaw's University to help newly freed slaves obtain a good education. Ida B. Wells attended Shaw's for her early education. However, her rebellious spirit got her kicked out at the age of 16 due to an altercation with the president of the college. When she was still 16, a wave of yellow fever killed her parents and one sibling. Ida B. Wells lied about her age and got a teaching job in order to keep all her siblings together after the tragedy. In 1882, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where she would eventually begin her career as an investigative journalist and anti-lynching activist. She was often alone in her efforts because she was radical, black, and a woman, but had constant support from Frederick Douglass. She wrote many fiery and impactful articles and pamphlets about the injustices faced by so-called criminals in the South. She also pioneered intersectional feminism and sought to desegregate the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century. Many of the same battles she fought regarding the disproportionate punishment of black people and the divide between feminism and white feminism due to inherent bias still exist today. Even though they are still present, Wells was relentless and successful in her efforts to begin the process of laying the foundation for future movements and clearly defining what the issues were and making the solutions obvious to the public. She did so much more than simply expose injustices. In 1884, Wells boarded a train and sat down in the ladies' car. Despite being a lady and having a ticket, the conductor told her to go to the African American car of the train. She refused and fought back against the efforts to move her, even biting the conductor. She was thrown off the train and decided to sue the rail company. She found a lawyer, and the court decided in her favor. The case was appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, where it was decided that she had the intention of causing difficulties to the railway, and the previous decision was reversed. This event directly led to her career in journalism, as she began to write articles under the pseudonym Iola. What would have been seen as a massive defeat to some people actually encouraged Wells to write about race and politics in the South. Wells soon became the editor of the Memphis Free Speech. She wrote an article pretty early on about segregated schools and how they were wrong. She discovered, while writing this article, that she made less than half as much money as her white counterparts. Even though this article lost her her job, instead of getting discouraged, she became even more dedicated to the newspaper. Free Speech was the most radical newspaper in Memphis because it talked about all kinds of controversial topics. Wells tackled one of the most controversial of all, lynchings. She began to write about lynchings after it came to her attention that they were used not exclusively to punish rapists and murderers, but also to prove white supremacy, when 3 black men were lynched after opening a grocery store that competed with a grocery store owned by whites. One of the men lynched had been a close friend of hers named Tom Moss. She responded to this event by encouraging African Americans to leave Memphis and move west. She made a trip to Oklahoma to prove how much safer it was than Memphis, despite people's prejudice about Native Americans. People who remained in Memphis boycotted businesses and public transportations that depended on African American customers. Wells began to receive death threats, but instead of shriveling up and hiding away, she began to carry a pistol with her, and essentially concluded that others should do the same if they did not wish to be lynched. She said that the only times an African American who was assaulted got away was when he had a gun for self-defense, and that, quote, when the white man, who is always the aggressor, knows he runs as great a risk of biting the dust as does every of his African American victims, he will have a greater respect for African American life. While Wells was in New York, a mob of white men burned down the Free Speech office and broke its printing press, which was enough to convince her not to return. She then proceeded to publish a pamphlet in which she described the countless examples of lynchings throughout the South that she had investigated, and she revealed what she believed to be the true idiotic reasons behind them. And it was not because of black men raping white women or black men killing white men. One reason she gave was that white men could not fathom a white person and a black person being in a consensual relationship. She gave countless examples of black men being lynched for this, one of whom was Ebenezer Fowler, the wealthiest man in the county, who was filled with bullets for being in a written correspondence with a white woman. Another reason she gave was a desire of whites to prove superior. She quoted a newspaper called the Evening Scimitar as saying that African Americans had obtained education at the hand of white taxpayers, and had, quote, just enough learning to make them realize how hopelessly their race was behind the other in everything that makes a great people, and they attempt to get even by insolence, which is ever the resentment of inferiors. She also said lynching increased after Reconstruction because African Americans were human beings, not slaves, and there was no longer an economic repercussion for killing them. In this pamphlet, she smacks you in the face again and again with the irony and injustice that went into lynching. She confronted how the color of the woman raped mattered when 3 men assaulted a black girl in Baltimore, Maryland, but were acquitted. Or when a white man assaulted a white girl, skipped town, and the white mob attacked a black man who had been near the crime. The girl, who had clearly seen her attacker to be a white man, was not allowed to testify because they said it would embarrass her, and the black man was lynched. Wells was the one who turned the tables and made the lynchers look like bloodthirsty barbarians rather than the African Americans looking like bloodthirsty barbarians. Take, for example, her writings about F. Grizzard, a black man charged with rape as so many people were. She stated, quote, "At the very moment these civilized whites were announcing their determination to protect their wives and daughters by murdering Grizzard, a white man was in the same jail for raping 8-year-old Maggie Reese. He was not harmed." She exposed how silly it is to see Grizzard as the bloodthirsty one, or at least see the lynchers as protectors. Along with this pamphlet, she continued on and wrote a 100-page pamphlet detailing the suffering of African Americans since 1863. The Red Record, as it is entitled, is an incredible piece because as she explored the cases for shockingly high amounts of lynchings, she was able to avoid being convicted as having a personal bias because she obtained all her statistics and stories from white sources, such as the Chicago Tribune and White Correspondences. These 2 pamphlets took the issue of lynching out of the South and expanded the audience beyond black people because it opened the eyes of many oblivious Northerners. Although Wells is best remembered for her brilliant journalism and anti-lynching activism, she was at the forefront of getting white feminist groups to support black women and assure that black women's voting rights were included in the 19th Amendment. Going back to the train, in 1884, Wells sat in the ladies' car because she knew that her being black did not make her any less of a lady, and she sued to prove that point. Even though she is most remembered for her anti-lynching activism, she never shied away from confronting white feminists abroad or at home, who disregarded lynchings and other hate crimes against black women. In 1882, she wrote for the newspaper The Women's Era, that was dedicated to racial issues surrounding suffrage and also anti-lynching. In 1893, the Women's Era Club became the first club for black women in the Boston area, and then in 1896, the NACWC, or National Association of Colored Women's Club, was founded in part by Ida B. Wells. This organization had the same goals as the Women's Era Club, just on a much larger scale. In 1913, while living in Chicago, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, because the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, did not allow her and other black women to join and voice their opinions. Even the National Women's Party, with more radical views founded by Alice Paul, did little more to include black women, except to allow segregation in order to maintain the support of Southern women for the 19th Amendment. Wells feared that if the opportunity arose to pass the amendment without enfranchising black women, there was a definite probability that the movement would end. Along with the creation of the Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913, she also went to a parade. She was to march with a group from Illinois. However, before the parade started, she was instructed to go to the back and march with a group of only black women. Being the person that she was, Wells said she would not march unless it was under the Illinois banner. Another woman from Illinois said she should be happy marching with her own race, to which Wells responded, "There is a difference," meaning between how that lady felt marching in a white section of the parade compared to how Wells felt being forced to march in a segregated unit. Quote, "Which you probably do not see. I shall not march with the colored women. Either I go with you or not at all. I am not taking the stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." And with that, she left, and people figured they dodged a real bullet and proceeded with the parade. But of course, Ida B. Wells is not the type of person to just leave after stating what she disagrees with. Instead, she hid in the crowd of spectators, and as the Illinois section passed, she stepped out and marched under the banner. This motion was so incredibly impactful on the suffrage movement because she forced everyone to realize that women's voting rights and black women's voting rights were not 2 separate issues. This action may not have helped in the short run because NASA felt even more justified in denying black women, but in the long run she brought attention to the issue of divided feminism. It was not Alice Paul or Elizabeth Cady Stanton that defined gender equality, even though Alice Paul did not actively reject black women. It was Ida B. Wells because she included race in the equation. Ida B. Wells deserves a place on the Wall of Fame, not only because of who she was in her period of time, that is, a civil rights leader who was not male and not traditionally minded, but because her efforts were first and laid the basis for bigger powers such as, according to Augustus Meyer, a professor of history from Kent State, the NAACP, which had similar goals and activities with an intensity that paralleled those of Wells. She also laid the basis for contemporary movements such as Because of Them, So Can We. She is overlooked for being the first to question stereotypes of black men. Not only did she question why so many people were lynched for being rapists, She investigated and risked her life to prove to everyone how wrong these assumptions were. Of course, these stereotypes are still relevant as ever, and mass lynchings have been replaced by mass incarcerations. But without her, the path to destroy such stereotypes, much less the punishments, would be much longer. It is because of her that historians today, such as Bryan Stevenson and his Equal Justice Initiative, are able to label slave warehouses and conduct projects to recognize those who were lynched. It is for these reasons that I nominate Ida B. Wells.